Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. I explain every week how this show is brought to you by direct financial support from listeners like you. Mostly via Patreon, but every now and then someone throws a few dollars my way via Buy Me a Coffee or the PayPal tip jar on the website. There have been some lean times in the last few years, and I wouldn't have been able to keep the show going without your support. And I'm grateful to those listeners who have the means to help fund it, to keep it going, and help me to continue to reach new audiences. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you to deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and of course, most importantly, if you can afford it, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales, or go to the link in the show notes or from the website to get access to those bonus episodes, as well as simply to keep the show going out to those who need it. I'm mentioning recently that I've lost a few patrons because times have been tough for a lot of people. And I've said that it's been a good time to sign up if people are considering it. And quite a few listeners really have stepped up in a big way. I've been offering the incentive that if I get to and stick to $100 a month on Patreon, I'll do a monthly bonus poetry reading to all patrons at all levels. We have in fact hit that goal, thanks to you all. Now I just need to stay there. And of course, that new monthly poetry reading is in addition to early release, which goes out to $2 patrons, and special edits and existing minisodes and megasodes, which go out to the $5 folks. The supporters this last week who pushed me over the line were Tim, who signed up as a patron. So thank you very much, Tim. Thanks for listening, and thank you for your support. And in addition to that, Sean bumped his backing to a new level to help me to reach my goal. I'm beyond grateful to the folks who've helped me out financially to keep the show going. It's not something that anybody needs to do, so it means a lot to me, and it really does help the listeners who can't help out with money in these tough times. But of course, if you're more inclined to make a once-off contribution, then check out buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales, where you can help out the show without needing to make a longer commitment. But while I've spent the last couple of minutes going on about money, there is another way you can help the show, and that is simply to spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. Thanks to Sarah recently for tagging me on Twitter recently when she was struggling to sleep. I'm so glad to help in any little way. And last but not least, of course, I gotta shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Their music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. Thank you very much for your time, and let's get back to the fun part. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with the anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? Well, I'm here to help. I'm Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes background noise or company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. For me, when I need to go to sleep at night, I need something to focus on. A story or an event that lets me keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep. But some people maybe need something a little bit different. Some kind of background, maybe some white noise or the sound of the ocean or the wind in the trees or the sound of the rain. Or maybe just some boring dude droning on, telling you some story that's not particularly interesting. But however you find it most helpful to engage with the show, it is important that you don't try force sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the tail and allow the sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, if all goes well, I'm hoping you're going to be asleep before I get to the end of the episode. But it's important that you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night with us, it probably won't work for you. I suggest giving it a solid 3 nights try to give it a used to the strangeness of the idea, to my voice, to the stories that I choose to tell. It's also possible that maybe one episode just isn't long enough. Maybe your problem isn't so much going to sleep, but you wake up in the middle of the night. What you can do in that case is just download a few episodes of the show, maybe enough to play through the whole night, and put them in a playlist and start them when you go to sleep and just let them run. In that case, when you wake up, if you like using earbuds, you can just pop them back in, go back to sleep again. Or if it's playing on a smart speaker or in the background, just carry on listening and waft back to sleep when you get the chance again. You can even do the same sort of thing if you wake up just before your alarm, 30 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever. It may sound strange to you why I go back to sleep when you only have 30 minutes left to go. But I've had people thank me for the suggestion that they do that because that part of the night can be so deeply relaxing on a whole new level. But it's very important that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. The King of the Mountains by Edmond. Translated from the French by Mrs. C. A. Kingsbury. Chapter 1. Herman Schultz. On the 3rd of July, about 6 o'clock in the morning, I was watering my flowers. A young man entered the garden. He was blond, beardless. He wore a German cap and sported gold spectacles. A long, loose woolen coat or paletot drooped in a melancholy way around his form, like a snail around a mast in a calm. He wore no gloves. His tan leather shoes had such large soles that the foot was surrounded by a narrow flange. In the breast pocket of his paletot, a huge porcelain pipe bulged halfway out. I did not stop to ask myself whether this young man was a student in the German universities. I put down my watering pot and saluted him with "Guten Morgen." "Monsieur," he said to me, in French, but with a deplorable accent. "My name is Herman Schultz. I've come to pass some months in Greece, and I've carried your book with me everywhere." This praise penetrated my heart with sweet joy. The stranger's voice seemed more melodious than Mozart's music, and I directed towards his gold glasses a swift look of gratitude. You would scarcely believe, dear reader, how much we love those who have taken the trouble to decipher our jargon. As for me, if I've ever sighed to be rich, it is in order to assure an income to all those who have read my works. I took him by the hand, this excellent young man. I seated him beside me on the garden bench. He told me that he was a botanist, that he had a commission from the Jardin des Plantes in Hamburg. In order to complete his herbarium, he was studying the country, the animals, and the people. His naive descriptions, his terse but just decisions, recalled to me, a little, the simple old Herodotus. He expressed himself awkwardly, but with a candor which inspired confidence. He emphasized his words with the tone of a man entirely convinced. He questioned me, if not of everyone in Athens, at least all the principal personages in my book. In the course of the conversation, he made some statements on general subjects, which seemed to me far more favorable than any which I had advanced. At the end of an hour, we had become good friends. I do not know which of us spoke first of brigandage. People who travel in Italy talk of paintings. Those who visit England talk of manufactures. Each country has its speciality. My dear sir, asked of my guest, have you met any brigands? Is it true, as is reported, that there are still bandits in Greece? It is only too true, he gravely replied. I was for 15 days in the hands of the terrible Hagdi Stavros, nicknamed the King of the Mountains. I speak then from experience. If you have leisure and a long story will not weary you, I am ready to give you the details of my adventure. You may make it of it what you please, a romance, a novel, or perhaps an additional chapter in the little book in which you have written so many curious facts. You are very good, I replied, and I am at your disposal. Let us go to my study. It is cooler there than in the garden, and yet we can enjoy the odor of the sweet peas and mignonette. He followed me, humming to himself in Greek a popular song. A robber with black eyes descends to the plains. His gun is heard at each step. He says to the vultures, do not leave me. I will serve you to the Pasha of Athens. He seated himself on a divan with his legs crossed under him like the Arabian storytellers, took off his loose paletot, lighted his pipe and began his tale. I seated myself at my desk and took stenographic notes as he dictated. I have always been without much distrust, especially with those who have complimented me. Sometimes the amiable stranger told me such surprising things that I asked myself many times if he was not mocking me. But his manner was so simple, his blue eyes so limpid, that my suspicions faded away on the instant. He talked steadily until half-afternoon. He stopped 2 or 3 times, only long enough to relight his pipe. He smoked with regular puffs, like the smokestack of a steam engine. Each time I raised my eyes, I beheld him, calm, smiling, in the midst of a thick cloud of smoke, like Jupiter in the 5th act of Amphitryon. We were interrupted by a servant with the announcement that breakfast was served. Herman seated himself opposite me, and my trifling suspicions vanished before his appetite. I said to myself that a good digestion rarely accompanies a bad conscience. The young German was too good an eater to be an untruthful narrator, and his veracity restored my faith in his veracity. Struck with this idea, I confessed, while offering him some strawberries, that I had for an instant doubted him. He replied with an angelic smile. I passed the entire day with my new friend, and I found that the time did not drag. At 5 o'clock he knocked the ashes from his pipe, put on his outer coat, and shaking my hand said adieu. I replied au revoir. No, he said, shaking his head. I leave tonight at 7 o'clock, and I dare not hope ever to see you again. Leave your address. I have not yet renounced the pleasure of travelling, and I may sometime pass through Hamburg. Unfortunately, I do not know where I shall pitch my tent. Germany is large. I may not remain a citizen of Hamburg. But if I publish your story, at least I ought to send you a copy. Do not take that trouble. As soon as the book is published, it will appear in Leipzig, and I will read it. Adieu. After his departure, I reread attentively what I had written. I found some remarkable details, but nothing which contradicts what I had seen and heard during my stay in Greece. At the moment of finishing the manuscript, a scruple restrained me. What if some errors had crept into Herman's statements? In my quality of editor, was I not responsible? To publish the story of the King of the Mountains, was it not to expose myself to editorial comments and criticisms? In my perplexity, I thought of making a copy of the original. I sent the first to Monsieur Perceptus. I begged him to point out candidly all the errors, and I promised to print his reply at the end of the volume. I reread the copy which I had retained. I changed no word in it. If I made myself the corrector of the young German statements, I would become his collaborator. So I discreetly withdrew. It is Herman who speaks to you. Chapter 2. Fortini. You divine from the appearance of my clothes that I have not 10,000 francs with me. My father is an innkeeper whom the railroads have ruined. In prosperous times he eats bread, in bad years potatoes. Add to this that there are 6 children, all with good appetites. The day on which I received my commission from the Jardin des Plantes, there was a festival given in the family. My departure would not only increase the portion of each of my brothers, but I was to have 250 francs per month, and the expenses for my journey. It was a fortune. From that moment they ceased to call me doctor. They dubbed me beef merchant, so that I should appear rich. My brothers prophesied that I would be elected professor by the university on my return from Athens. My father hoped that I would return married. In his position of innkeeper, he had assisted in some very romantic adventures. He cited at least 3 times a week the marriage of the Princess Ipsof and Lieutenant Renaud. The princess occupied the finest apartments with her 2 maids and a courier, and she gave 20 florins a day. The French lieutenant was in number 17, way up under the eaves, and he paid 1.5 florins, food included. However, after a month's sojourn at the hotel, he departed in a carriage with the Russian lady. My poor father, with the partiality of a father, thought that I was handsomer and more elegant than Lieutenant Renaud. He did not doubt but that sooner or later I would meet a princess who would enrich us all. If I did not find her at a table d'hôte, I would see her in a railway carriage. If the powers which controlled the railroads were not propitious, there was still left in the steamships. The evening of my departure, we drank a bottle of old Rhine wine, and by chance the last was poured into my glass. The good man wept with joy. It was a sure sign, and nothing could prevent me from marrying within a year. I respected his superstitions, and I refrained from saying that princesses rarely travel 3rd class. As for lodgings, my humble luggage would not permit me to choose any but modest inns, and royal families do not usually lodge in them. The fact is that I landed in Greece without an adventure of any kind. The army occupying the city made everything very dear in Athens. The Hotel d'Angleterre, the Hotel Orient, the Hotel des Étrangers were inaccessible. The Chancellor of the Prussian legation, to whom I had brought a letter of introduction, was kind enough to assist me in finding a lodging. He took me to a pastry cook's at the corner of the Rue d'Aume and the Place du Palais. I found there board and lodging for 100 francs a month. Christodule was an old palacar, decorated with the Iron Cross, in memory of the War of Independence. He was a lieutenant in the phalanx. He wore the national costume, the red bonnet with the blue tassel, the silver-colored vest, the white skirt, and the fancy leggings, when he sold ices and cakes. His wife Marula was enormous, like all Greek women who have passed 50. Her husband had purchased her during the war, when women sold for high prices. She was born in the Isle of Hydra, but she dressed in the Athenian fashion, upper garment or jacket of black velvet, skirt of a bright color, a silk handkerchief tied over her head. Neither Christodule nor his wife knew a word of German, but their son Dmitri, who was a servant hired by the day, and who dressed like a Frenchman, understood and spoke a little of each patois of Europe. Upon the whole, I really had no need for an interpreter. Without having received the gift of tongues, I am a fairly good linguist, and I murder Greek as readily as English, Italian, or French. My hosts were worthy people. They gave me a little whitewashed room with a table of white wood, 2 straw-bottomed chairs, a good but thin mattress, and some cotton quilts. A wooden bed is a superfluity which the Greeks readily deny themselves, and we lived a la Greek. I breakfasted on a cup of arrowroot. I dined on a plate of meat with many olives and dry fish. I supped on vegetables, honey, and cakes. Preserves were not rare in the house, and occasionally I evoked memories of home by dining on a leg of lamb and preserves. It is useless to tell you that I had my pipe, and that the tobacco in Athens is better than yours. That which contributed to my feeling perfectly at home in Christodule's house was a light wine of Santorin which he bought, I know not where. I am not a judge of wines, and the education of my palate has unfortunately been neglected. But I believe, however, that this wine is worthy of a place on a king's table. It is of a fine topaz color, sparkling as the smile of a child. I see it now, in its large balding carafe, on the shining linen cloth. It lighted the table, and we were able to sup without any other illumination. I never drank much of it, because it was heady, and yet at the end of a meal I have recited some of Anacreon's verses, and have discovered remains of beauty in the moon-shaped face of the gross Marula. I ate with Christodule and his family. There were 4 regular boarders and 1 table boarder. The first floor was divided into 4 rooms, the best of which was occupied by French archaeologist, Monsieur Hippolyte Marinet. If all Frenchmen resemble this one, you would be a sorry lot. He was very small. His age, as far as one could tell, anywhere between 18 and 45. Very red-haired, very mild, very loquacious, and never loosening his moist and warm hands when he had once fastened them on a person, until he had exhausted himself talking. His 2 dominant passions were archaeology and philanthropy. He was a member of many literary societies and of many benevolent associations. Although he was an advocate of charity and his parents had left him a fine income, I do not remember ever to have seen him give a sou to a beggar. As for his knowledge of archaeology, I believe that it was of more account than his love for humanity. He had received a prize from some provincial college for a treatise on the value of paper in the time of Orpheus. Encouraged by these successes, he had come to Greece to gather material for more important work. It was nothing less than to determine the quantity of oil consumed in Demosthenes' lamp when he wrote the second Philippic. My two other neighbors were not so wise, and ancient things disturbed them not at all. Giancomo Fondi was a poor Maltese employed at I know not what consulate. He earned 150 francs a month sealing letters. I imagine that any other employment would have pleased him better. Nature, who has peopled the island of Malta in order that the Orient should never lack porters, has given to poor Fondi the shoulders, arms, and hands of a Milo of Crotona. He was born to handle a club and not to melt sealing wax with which to seal letters. He used, however, 2 or 3 sticks every day. Man is not the master of his destiny. The islander out of his sphere was in his element only at mealtime. He helped Marula to place the table, and you will understand, without being told, that he always carried it at arm's length. He ate like the hero of the Iliad, and I shall never forget the cracking of his huge jaws, the dilation of his nostrils, the flash of his eyes, and the whiteness of his 32 teeth, formidable millstones of which he was the mill. I ought to confess that I remember little of his conversation. One easily found the limit of his intelligence, but one never found the bounds of his appetite. Christodule had never made anything during the 4 years he had boarded him, although the Maltese had paid 10 francs a month extra. The insatiable islander ate every day, after dinner, an enormous plateful of nuts, which he cracked between his first finger and thumb. Christodule, old soldier but practical man, followed this exercise with a mixture of admiration and fear. He trembled for his dessert, yet he was proud to see, at his table, so huge a nutcracker. The face of Giacomo Fondi would not have been out of place in one of the jumping-jack boxes which so amused children. It was white, but it was a question of shade only. His thick locks descended to his eyebrows like a cap. In strange contrast, this Caliban had a very small foot, a slender ankle, a fine-shaped leg, and as perfect as one finds in a statue. But these were details which one scarcely noticed. For whoever had seen him eat, his person began at the edge of the table. The rest of the body counted for nothing. I can speak only from memory of William Lobster. He was a cherub of 20 years, blonde, rosy and chubby, but a cherub of the United States of America. The firm of Lobster & Sons, New York, had sent him to the Orient to study the subject of exportation. He worked during the day in the house of Phillips Brothers. In the evening he read Emerson. In the early morning or at sunrise he went to Socrates' school to practice pistol shooting. The most interesting person in our little colony was without a doubt John Harris, the maternal uncle of Little Lobster. The first time that I dined with this strange man, I was greatly taken with the American. He was born at Vandalia, Illinois. Breathing the invigorating air of the New World from his birth, his every movement was joyous. I do not know whether the Harris family was rich or poor, whether the son went to college or whether he educated himself. What was certain was that at 28 he relied on himself alone, was astonished at nothing, believed nothing impossible, never flinched, was amenable to reason, hoped for the best, attempted everything, triumphed in everything. If he fell, he immediately jumped up. If he stammered, he began all over again. He gave himself no rest, never lost courage, and went right ahead. He was well educated, had been teacher, lawyer, journalist, miner, farmer, clerk. He had read everything, seen everything, tried everything, and had travelled over more than half the globe. When I made his acquaintance, he was commanding a dispatch boat, carrying 60 men and 4 cannons. He wrote of the Orient in the Boston Review. He transacted business with an indigo house in Kolkata, and yet he found time to come 4 or 5 times a week to dine with his nephew Lobster, and with us. A single instance of 1,000 will serve to show his character. Early in the 50s, he was in business in Philadelphia. His nephew, who was then 17, made him a visit. He found him near Washington Square, standing with his hands in his pockets before a burning building. William touched him on the shoulder. He turned. "Ah, good morning, Bill. Thou hast arrived inopportunely, my boy. There is a fire which ruins me. I have $40,000 in that house. We will not save a match." "What will you do?" asked the astonished boy. "What will I do? It is 11 o'clock. I am hungry. I have a little money in my pocket. I am going to take you to breakfast." Harris was one of the most slender and most elegant men I have ever seen. He had a manly air, a fine forehead, a clear and proud eye. Americans are never deformed or mean-looking. And do you know why? Because they are not bound in the swaddling clothes of a narrow civilization. Their minds and their bodies develop at will. Their schoolroom is the open air. Their master, exercise. Their nurse, liberty. I never cared especially for Monsieur Marinet. I looked at Giacomo Fondi with the indifferent curiosity with which one gazes at foreign animals. The little lobster inspired me with lukewarm interest. But I conceived a warm affection for Harris. His frank face, his simple manners, his sternness which was not without sweetness, his hasty yet chivalrous temper, the oddities of his humour, the enthusiasm of his sentiments appealed to me more strongly as I was neither enthusiastic nor hasty. We admire in others what we lack ourselves. Giacomo wore white clothes because he was black. I adore Americans because I am German. As for the Greeks, I knew little of them even after 4 months' sojourn in their country. Nothing is easier than living in Athens without coming in contact with the natives. I did not go to a cafe. I did not read the Pandore, nor the Minerve, nor any other paper of the country. I did not go to the theatre because I have a sensitive ear and a false note hurts me more cruelly than a blow. I lived with my hosts, my herbarium, and with John Harris. I could have presented myself at the palace, thanks to my diplomatic passport and my official title. I had sent my card to the master and mistress of ceremonies, and I could count upon an invitation to the first court ball. I kept in reserve for this occasion a beautiful red coat, embroidered with silver, which my Aunt Rosenthaler had given to me the night before my departure. It was her husband's uniform. He was an assistant in a scientific institute and prepared the specimens. My good aunt, a woman of great sense, knew that a uniform was well received in all countries, above all if it was red. My elder brother had remarked that I was larger than my uncle, as the sleeves were too short, but Papa quickly replied that only the silver embroidery would catch the eye, and that princesses would not examine the uniform closely. Unfortunately, the court was not dancing that season. The winter pleasures were the flowering of almond, peach, and lemon trees. There was a vague report of a ball to be given on the 15th of May. It made a stir in the city, as a few semi-official journals took it up, but there was nothing positively known about it. My studies kept pace with my pleasures. Slowly. I knew by heart the botanical gardens of Athens. They were neither very beautiful nor very full, it was a subject soon mastered. The royal gardens offered far more to study. An intelligent Frenchman had collected for it all the riches of the vegetable kingdom, from the palms of the West Indies to the sassafrage of the north. I passed whole days there studying Monsieur Barrot's collections. The garden is public only at certain hours, but I spoke Greek to the guards, and for the love of the Greek, they permitted me to enter. Monsieur Barrot did not seem to weary of my company. He took me everywhere for the pleasure of discussing botany and speaking French. In his absence, I hunted up the head gardener and questioned him in German. It is well to be polyglot. I searched for plants every day in the surrounding country, but never as far from the city as I should like to have gone. There were many brigands around Athens. I'm not a coward. The following story will prove it to you. But I love my life. It is a present which I received from my parents. I wish to preserve it as long as possible, in remembrance of my father and mother. In the month of April, 1856, it was dangerous to go far from the city. It was even imprudent to live outside. I did not venture upon the slopes of La Becquetis without thinking of poor Madame Darot, who was robbed in broad daylight. The hills of Daphne recalled to me the capture of 2 French officers. Upon the road to Piraeus, I thought involuntarily of the band of brigands who travelled in 6 carriages, as if on a pleasure tour, and who shot at passers-by from the coach doors. The road to Pentelicus recalled the stopping of the Duchess de Plassans, or the recent history of Harris and Lobster's adventure. They were returning from an excursion on 2 Persian horses belonging to Harris, when they fell into an ambuscade. 2 brigands, weapons in hand, stopped them in the middle of a bridge. They glanced all around and saw at their feet, in a ravine, a dozen rascals armed to the teeth, who were guarding 50 or 60 prisoners. All who had passed that way since sunrise had been despoiled, then bound so that no one could escape to give the alarm. Harris and his nephew were unarmed. Harris said to the young man in English, "Give up your money. It will not pay to be killed for $20. The brigands took the money, without letting go the bridles. Then they showed the Americans the ravine and signed to them to descend. Harris now lost patience. It was repugnant to him to be bound. He was not the kind of wood of which one makes fires. He looked at the little lobster, and at the same instant 2 fist blows like chain shots struck the heads of the 2 brigands. William's adversary fell over on his back, at the same time discharging his pistol. Harris's brigand, struck more forcibly, toppled over the cliff and fell among his comrades. Harris and Lobster were by this time quite a distance away, jamming the spurs into their horses. The horses were killed. The young men disengaged themselves, took to their heels, and when they reached the city, warned the police, who started in pursuit of the brigands the second morning after. Our excellent Christodiol learned with grief of the death of the 2 horses, but he found not a word of blame for the killers. "What would you have?" he asked, with charming simplicity. "It is their business." All Greeks are, more or less, of our host's opinion. It is not that the brigands spare their countrymen and reserve the harshness for strangers, but a Greek, robbed by his brother, says to himself with a certain resignation that the money is all in the family. Native moralists complained of the excesses committed in the country, as a father deplores his son's pranks. He groans loudly, but secretly admires him. He would be ashamed if he was like his neighbor's son, who never had to be spoken to. It was a fact that at the time of my arrival, the hero of Athens was the scourge of Attica. In the salons and in the cafes, in the barber shops where the common people congregated, at the pharmacies where the bourgeois were to be found, in the muddy streets of the bazaars, in the dusty square of Belgrace, at the theatre, at the Sunday concerts, and upon the road to Patricia, one heard only of the great Hagdi Stavros. One swore only by Hagdi Stavros the Invincible, Hagdi Stavros the Terror of the Police, Hagdi Stavros the King of the Mountains. They almost composed, God pardon me, a litany on Hagdi Stavros. One Sunday, a little while after his adventure, John Harris dined with us. I started Christodule upon the subject of Hagdi Stavros. Our host had often visited him years before, during the War of Independence, when brigandage was less discussed than now. He emptied his glass of seltzerine, stroked his grey moustache, and began a long recital, interspersed with many sighs. He informed us that Stavros was the son of a bishop or priest of the Greek Church in the island of Tino. He was born God knew in what year. Greeks of early times knew not their ages, because registries of the civil state are an invention of the decadent. His father, who destined him for church, taught him to read. When he was about 20 years of age, he made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and added to his name the title Hagdi, which means pilgrim. Hagdi Stavros, returning to his own country, was taken prisoner by a pirate. The conqueror found him amenable to reason and made a sailor of him. Thus he began to make war on Turkish ships, and generally on those which had not mounted guns. At the end of several years he tired of working for others and determined to push out for himself. He possessed neither boat nor money to buy one. Necessity compelled him to practice piracy on land. The rising of the Greeks against Turkey permitted him to fish in troubled waters. He never could tell exactly whether he was a brigand or an insurgent, whether he commanded a band of thieves or insurrectionists. His hatred of the Turks did not blind him to the degree that he could pass a Greek village without seeing it and sacking it. All money was good to him, whether it came from friend or foe, from a simple theft or a glorious pillage. Such wise impartiality rapidly increased his fortune. The shepherds hastened to place themselves under his banner when they learned that good pay might be expected. His reputation bought him an army. The leaders of the insurrection knew of his exploits, but not of his thrift. In those times one saw only the bright side of everything. Lord Byron dedicated an ode to him. Poets and orators in Paris compared him to Epaminondas, and even to poor Aristides. Some sent him embroidered clothes from the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Others sent subsidies. He received money from France, from England, and from Russia. I will not swear that he never received any from Turkey. He was a true Palikar. At the end of the war he was besieged, with other chiefs, in the Acropolis at Athens. He slept in the Propylaeum, between Margaritis and Lagandus, and each had his treasure hid in the blanket which covered him. One summer night, the roof fell so cleverly that it killed everyone but Hagdi Stavros, who was smoking his pipe in the open air. He secured his companion's money, and everyone thought that he well deserved it. But a misfortune that he had not foreseen checked his successful career. Peace was declared. Hagdi Stavros retired to the country with his spoils, and became a spectator of strange occurrences. The powers which had freed Greece attempted to found a kingdom. Some offensive words came buzzing around the hairy ears of the old robber. He heard rumors of government, of armies, of public order. He laughed when told that his possessions were included in one sub-prefecture, but when an employee from the treasury presented himself to collect the yearly taxes, he became serious. He threw the man out of the door, not without having relieved him of all he had brought with him. Justice sought to punish him. He took to the mountains. It was as well, for he was tired of his house. He felt to a certain extent that he owned a roof, but on condition that he slept above it. His former companions in arms had scattered all over the kingdom. The state had given them lands. They cultivated them reluctantly and ate sparingly of the bitter thread of labor. When they learned that their chief was at variance with the law, they sold their farms and hastened to join him. As for the brigand, he rented his lands. He had the qualifications for an administrator. Peace and idleness had made him ill and unhappy. The mountain air restored his cheerfulness and health, so that in 1840 he thought of marriage. He was assuredly past 50, but men of his temper have nothing to do with old age. Death even looks at them twice before it attacks them. He married an heiress with a magnificent dowry from one of the best families in Laconia, and thus became allied to the highest personages of the kingdom. After giving birth to a daughter, she took a fever and died. He brought up the child himself, with all the care and tenderness of a mother. When the brigands saw him dancing the babe on his knees, they exclaimed with admiration. Paternal love gave a new impetus to his mind. In order to amass a royal dowry for his daughter, he studied the money question, upon which he had previously held very primitive views. Instead of hoarding up his treasures in strong boxes, he put them out at interest. He learned all the ins and outs of speculation. He followed closely the stock markets at home and abroad. It asserted that, struck with the advantage of the French Joint Stock Company, he even thought of placing brigandage on the market. He made many journeys to Europe in the company of a Greek from Marseille who served as an interpreter. During his stay in England, he assisted in an election in I not know what rotten borough of Yorkshire. This beautiful spectacle inspired him with profound reflections on constitutional government and its profits. He returned to Greece, determined to exploit his theories and gain an income for himself. He burned a goodly number of villages in the service of the opposition. He destroyed a few others in the interests of the Conservative Party. When it was considered desirable to overthrow a ministry, it was only necessary to plant him. He proved conclusively that the police were very corrupt, and that safety could only be obtained by changing the cabinet. But in revenge he gave some rude lessons to the enemies of order, in punishing them in whatever way they had sinned. His political talents made him so well known that all parties held him in high esteem. His counsels, his election methods, were nearly always followed so well that, contrary to the principle of the government representative, who wished one deputy to express the wishes of many men, he was represented, he alone, by about 30 deputies. An intelligent minister, the celebrated Lacy, had suggested that a man who meddles so officiously in government affairs might possibly sometime damage the machine. He undertook to bind his hands with golden cord. He made an arrangement to meet him at Carvati, between Hymettus and Pentelicus, in the country house of a foreign consul. Hugdi Stavros came, without escort and without arms. The minister and the brigand, who were old acquaintances, breakfasted together like two old friends. At the end of the meal, Relatis offered him full amnesty for himself and his followers, a brevet of general division, title of senator, and 10,000 hectares of forests. The Palikar hesitated some time, and then at last said, "I should perhaps have accepted at 20, but today I am too old. I do not wish, at my age, to change my manner of living. Dusty Athens does not please me. I should go to sleep in the Senate chamber, and if you should give me soldiers to command, I might discharge my pistols into the uniforms from force of habit. Return then to your own affairs, and leave me to attend to mine." Relatis would not own that he was beaten. He tried to enlighten the brigand as to the infamy of his life. Hagdi Stavros laughed and said with amiability, My friend, the day when we shall write down our sins, which will have the longest list. You think then that you'll cheat destiny? You will die, some day or other, a violent death. Gracious Lord, Allah Kareem, he replied in Turkish. Neither you nor I have read the stars, but I have at least one advantage. My enemies wear a uniform and I recognize them afar off. You cannot say as much for years. Adieu, brother. 6 months afterward, the minister was assassinated by political enemies. The brigand still lived. And on that slightly dark note, I think we're going to call it a night. This is, so far, a pretty fascinating read. So if you'd like to pick up where we're leaving off, you can, as always, find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.